What's up, everybody? My name's Adam McDormand, and this is American Literature. Now, the next story that you're going to read for this class is another excellent short story. We've got The Chrysanthemums by John Steinbeck. Now, as always, it's going to be really helpful in order to get the most out of this text to know just a little bit about the background of the author, a little bit about the historical context surrounding this story, and a few of the key literary features that the author uses to convey some big ideas. John Steinbeck lived from 1902 to 1968. He grew up in a place called Salinas, California, which was a relatively sparsely populated kind of agricultural region about 25 miles from the Pacific coast. Now, Steinbeck spent many of his summers working on farms and ranches in the area around the Salinas Valley, often alongside migrant workers. Now, if you don't know what a migrant worker is, that is someone who's hired on seasonally. As the name implies, often migrant workers would move around the country during different growing seasons in order to find work year-round. Later on in life, both the California coast and the Salinas Valley would serve as inspiration for the setting of many of Steinbeck's stories. Similarly, many of the characters in Steinbeck's stories would be members of the working class. Steinbeck would depict these people in his stories with a great degree of respect and dignity. Steinbeck graduated from high school in 1919 and went on to Stanford University to study English literature, but he dropped out in 1925. A few of his notable works include Of Mice and Men, which was published in 1937. Now, that's a book that has at times been a part of the curriculum for this class and other times has not. It's an extraordinary story, very concise, but also extremely impactful. If you get a chance to read this story, I highly recommend it. He also wrote The Grapes of Wrath, which may very well be his most well-known story. That was published in 1939. And then he also wrote Cannery Row in 1945 and East of Eden in 1952, just to name a few. Steinbeck won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction after the publishing of The Grapes of Wrath in 1939, and actually the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1962. Probably the most significant historical event reflected in Steinbeck's work would be the Great Depression. Now, just to touch on this very briefly, the Great Depression was a major worldwide economic downturn that lasted for most of the 1930s. Now, it started in the U.S. with the stock market crash in October of 1929 and resulted in decreased international trade and massive unemployment. We're talking almost a quarter of Americans left without work, and worldwide there were countries that had almost a third, almost 33% of their working population without jobs. And because of Steinbeck's special relationship with the working class, he was well positioned to capture both the economic and emotional trauma of this economic catastrophe, primarily in works like The Grapes of Wrath. But even though this event doesn't play a key role in the Chrysanthemums, it is very much a part of the backdrop. It's part of the culture that this story is taking place within. So, a few literary features of this story. The Chrysanthemums is a strong example of literary realism. Now, that's a literary genre that attempts to depict the world as it really is. And that means featuring regular people within the events of regular everyday life. Now, even though the Chrysanthemums focuses on the events of a normal day for these characters, there's something significant happening beneath the surface of this story. It is very much a character-driven story. There's no flashy external conflict to be found. There's not a quest to slay a dragon. There is no warfare, no laser swords and intergalactic empires. This is a story about characters. Specifically, characters who within this story are struggling to find the meaning within the mundanity of the daily grind. Okay, people trying to figure out What is the purpose of this thing that just keeps happening, these tasks that I have to do, my work? For many of us, this is eminently relatable. Under normal circumstances, we find ourselves every day going to school, doing the same classes over and over again, and it seems mundane, it seems monotonous, it seems maybe boring even. And at times, it can be a struggle to find meaning and worth in those repeated events, the vocab quiz that pops up every Monday, the Socratic discussion that just has to happen every Wednesday. Where is the meaning and purpose in all of that? And I think what this story begins to convey is that if you chip away at the surface of the mundanity a little bit, you begin to see what is real at the heart of the characters in the story and the characters that you encounter in your real life. There is a purpose to all of it, but you have to take the time and put in the effort to find what that purpose is. So that brings us to an important warning about this story. If you read this story simply at a surface level, it is not very interesting, it is not very engaging. However, this is an excellent story to practice your literary analysis with, because it doesn't take much to sort of chip away at the surface of this story and begin to see what's underneath, to see the meaning, to see the themes at work in these characters' lives as they try to make sense of this whole thing. And lastly, let's take a look at a few big ideas that are hiding beneath the surface of this story if you're willing to take the time to actually look for them. Many of these big ideas are sort of interconnected with one another, so you'll see some connections between a lot of the themes here, and once you pull on one of those thematic threads, if you will, you'll begin to see more and more of what's going on in these characters' lives below the surface. One of the major thematic ideas in the story is the question about the meaning and purpose of marriage. What are the gender roles involved? Is a man supposed to do something specific in a marriage? Is a woman supposed to provide something very particular in that marriage? And that brings up questions about the independence that an individual may feel versus their partnership, versus the role that they're supposed to play in that marriage. Very much connected to that, with the character of Elisa, who is our protagonist, there's a question about feminine strength and sexuality. Now, below the surface of this story, there is a palpable sort of tension for Elisa, trying to figure out what she is capable of, trying to figure out if she is strong enough to carry out the role that's assigned to her as wife. What is it that a woman is supposed to do in a marriage? Is she simply supposed to bear children? There are a lot of symbols of womanhood all over this story, from the idea of planting a seed and cultivating a flower, from it being perhaps symbolic for a woman's role to bear children in a marriage, all the way to how she presents herself, how she dresses. Especially toward the end of the story, you'll see that she wants to feel like a desirable woman. Does her husband make her feel like she is loved, not just for what she can provide, but for who she is, the feminine energy that she may have? Again, connected to that, we have this big idea of the self, of understanding the self, and then being understood. That is a massive need for all human beings, to know and be known. Maybe kind of a minor one, but also still really important given the historical and cultural context surrounding the story, and that is economic limitation. That means oftentimes that it gives people less independence. It squashes them down into very specific roles. I need my wife to do this thing because if she doesn't, we're toast. We're not going to be able to pay the bills, and we're going to go under, right? And as a man, then, because of that economic limitation, the husband in the story, he has an idea of what he has to do, that if he doesn't maintain his role, again, we're in big trouble. We're going to go under, because it's during the Great Depression. Everything has to work in order for us to survive. We're counting on each other, and that economic limitation forces us into our lanes. You could very easily compare Elisa to a character like Daisy Buchanan from The Great Gatsby, who has tons of money. It's really no problem at all for her to decide to do nothing or to be spontaneous with her actions, to just stop and go into the city and drink all day, because there are no economic limitations for her. It's not necessary for her to do a very specific thing in her role as a wife in her marriage in order for them to survive. It's very different than a story like the Chrysanthemums, where the characters have to fulfill their roles in order to keep things going. Now, if you think about it, all of these big thematic ideas could be reduced down to a relationship between agency and structure. And this is a thing we've talked about throughout the course of the year. Agency is a person's ability to make their own decisions, to act of their own free will. And on the other end, structure is anything that constrains or limits that free will. And that could be anything from a law to a social norm to just an expectation that a person may place on themselves. And whenever this topic comes up, we've discussed the fact that really neither agency nor structure are inherently bad. It's not until you push them to their extremes that real serious problems start to come up. Obviously, nobody should be able to act with complete agency, free of any kind of consequence. And similarly, nobody should be subjected to complete tyrannical structure. Often it comes down to a tipping point between something being good and bad. Take, for instance, Elisa's marriage in the Chrysanthemums. Obviously, marriage is a structure that provides strength and protection for both people. And to some degree, Elisa's very real and very understandable need for agency and an independence and a personal identity is a good thing that could potentially undermine some of that strength and protection of that structure. But on the other end, if that structure is so constrictive, so oppressive, that it begins to limit that real need for personal identity, you can start to see that relationship become unhealthy. And that is one of the central questions of the Chrysanthemums. Where does this fall? Does it tip one way or another? If so, is any one of these individuals at fault for that being the case? And that works really for each of these major thematic threads. Think about economic limitations. Obviously, nobody should have complete economic agency to do whatever they want with no regard for the economic systems, right? Those economic structures that are meant to provide a means for everyone to take care of themselves. And of course, if you go to the other end, it's really a bad thing for someone to have so little money that they are left with so few options that they can't make decisions, because sometimes that will lead to people doing very desperate things in order to just have a little more agency. And really, if you boil all of the big thematic ideas in this story down to a relationship between agency and structure, that gives you a means to connect this story to just about anything else that we've read this year, because many of those texts feature characters who are kind of on a tipping point, trying to reach for agency or trying to provide some structure, and maybe that struggle tips between good and bad in the narrative. Anyways, that's going to do it for this video. I really hope that you take the time to look beyond the subtlety of Steinbeck's work in the Chrysanthemums to find what makes the story so intense, the questions that it's asking, and we'll get together and talk about it very soon. As always, good luck, have fun, what a time to be alive.